Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Good to see you.
All right. Well, you just released as part of FIRE this annual ranking that you do for colleges. Tell us a little bit about what this project is all about.
I'm extremely proud of the rankings that we did. Revealing my age on the beard kind of gives me away anyway. I've been at FIRE for 24 years on October 2nd, and that entire time, people have been asking me to rank schools according to how good they are for freedom of speech. But as hopefully my writing makes clear, I take my social science very seriously, and my answer was always, no, we don't have enough data. Like, we can tell you if your speech codes are up to constitutional standards, but we don't have enough to actually say pretty comprehensively whether or not this school is better than the others. But that changed in 2019 when College Pulse set up shop, and they're a company that's able to create statistically relevant panels on different campuses that actually accurately show the environment for freedom of speech, and able to poll students at these campuses. And so in 2019, we started the pilot project where we'd ask students like, are you able to disagree with each other? Are you able to disagree with your professors? On the one hand, but then some other versions of it. Do you think the university will have your back if you get in trouble for your speech? Barnard, by the way, this year scored dead last on this, which is one of the reasons why they did really poorly. All of the bottom five did really poorly on that part. But then the kind of more disturbing thing that we asked them is, do you think various forms of violence are ever acceptable in response to speech? And so, the lightest version of it is a shout down. But we asked them also directly, like, do you think violence in response to speech is okay? And those numbers have gotten progressively worse over the years. So that's just the survey part of it. We've also added the largest database of professor cancellations, so it tends to get professors fired for their speech. The largest database of student cancellations, attempts to get students punished for their speech. Deplatforming, which of course includes things like shout downs and violence in response to speech. And of course, our original database, the largest database of speech codes ever done. And we factor these all together, and in order to really, we try to improve the methodology every year to give the most accurate picture of what the best schools are for freedom of speech. This year, somewhat to my own surprise, University of Virginia ended up being number one. It pushed Michigan Technological University to number two. I wasn't totally surprised that Michigan Technological University was number one last year. It's got lots of characteristics that actually, including being a state school, including being more technologically oriented, including having a nice viewpoint diversity among the students that often define a school that's good for freedom of speech. But the ones in the bottom five were, as I mentioned, Barnard, Penn, University of Pennsylvania, NYU, and then the last two were Columbia, and then Harvard at dead last. And they really earned it. I mean, the biggest things you're going to get is if you punish a professor for their speech, or punish students for their speech, or tolerate deplatforming, or have terrible codes. But all of these universities also did terribly, actually, our term for it is abysmally, on whether or not students thought they would have, if push came to shove, they would have their backs in a case of defending their freedom of speech. And generally, students at these elite colleges said absolutely not.
Well, for our audience, there's like some kind of huge drill going on in the building next to me, so I apologize to them.
I can't hear it.
Well, yeah, they'll probably pick it up, but that's okay because you're the one they're here to listen to anyway. So let's take a case study here to just dive in and say, like, what happens to a university that backslides? So it seems like NYU is a good instructive case here, where they had, they dropped something like 10 places in the rankings. So what do we know about what's going on in NYU over the past year?
So a lot of people point to the encampments, for example, as being, something where universities were dinged when they tried to shut down encampments. And that's overly simple. University of Virginia, came out, and the difference is how honest you are with your students. And University of Virginia came out and said, "Listen, you've never actually had a legal right to form permanent encampments, or even long-term encampments on our campus. It's not a First Amendment right you generally have. So we will enforce that rule. You're entitled to protest in all different other ways, and we'll try to make that as easy as possible, and we will not discriminate on the basis of viewpoint." And students were receptive to that level of clarity and honesty. The schools in New York that did really badly kind of wanted to have it both ways. They were kind of like, well, yeah, encampment protests are something we've protected forever, and we're gonna tolerate this for a really long time. But then, kind of rapidly, and Columbia was actually the worst offender in this, by the way. Then rapidly changed their mind and then called in the police. And there was no consistency, there was no clear message, and it created an environment in which students were literally guessing as to whether or not they would be allowed to do that to engage in regular protest. So all of the schools, and NYU is no exception, that did poorly in the rankings, mishandled the encampments, partially by not willing to be honest and straightforward with their students from the very beginning.
Yeah, I can imagine this puts you in a difficult place because you have largely been an advocate for free speech on campus. But, and I've heard you talk about this before, the timing of some people's come to Jesus on free speech is has kind of created its own set of questions. Yes, so talk about that a little bit.
Well, that was one of the things that was funny about the congressional testimony, the congressional anti-Semitism testimony last December. And I'm going to say something that might surprise some people. I actually thought, at least to a degree, to a not very this is going to sound obnoxious too, but to not a very sophisticated level, the university presidents handled the question whether or not, say, from the river to the sea, the chant, whether or not that's protected, and they answered it correctly by saying, actually, that depends on context, because in isolation, I mean, the answer is, to a degree, of course it is. Like even if you take the worst definition of it, saying that this country should be wiped off the map, is that protected speech? Yes, it is. It can't be banned simply because it's highly offensive to some people. But so when they said that, when it came to a lot of these big questions, it depends on the context, they were ultimately right. But the reason why I didn't have a lot of sympathy for them, and I want to be clear, I do actually have a little bit of sympathy for the president of MIT. MIT has backslid as far as free speech is concerned, but they're definitely not as bad as the rest of the Ivy League when it comes to freedom of speech. So I felt like it was almost unfair that they were in that group. But Harvard and Penn have been terrible, for ages now. So there was a little bit of sort of, poetic justice to the fact that at the moment when Harvard and Columbia needed the credibility. Harvard and Penn needed the credibility to say we are consistent on freedom of speech. Nobody believed them because they hadn't been. So I do think that if people are starting to get the value of freedom of speech because suddenly causes the free speech rights of people they're sympathetic to are suddenly threatened, I'll take it. That's oftentimes the way that people get to freedom of speech, is they have this kind of attitude of free speech, what's in it for me? Definitely not the most principled perspective, but if it's going to get you there and then you're consistent on it, I'll take it. But the problem is, what I'm afraid is going to happen is that universities, that are not particularly sympathetic to the pro-Palestinian standpoint, are going to take this moment and clamp down on speech that they don't like, or ones that are highly sympathetic to it are going to suddenly defend freedom of speech because they're sympathetic to the cause. But the next time it's speech they're not sympathetic to, they're going to throw it right out the window. So it gives me some cautious optimism. I'm realistic about human nature, that generally in a lot of cases people want free speech for me but not for thee. You would hope universities were more sophisticated than that. But if this has marked a change in which they reevaluate everything they're doing and are good from now on, I'll take it. But you can't blame me for being a little cynical about it.
Well, this begs the question as to what is the right playbook here. Because as I was watching Shafiq at Columbia, I was like, I don't follow Columbia that closely, but I live in New York, and I saw her, and I was like, is she getting punished because she's being too restrictive on speech or not restrictive enough? Because if you look at what the board of directors was saying versus the student body and professors, they each had problems with her coming from different directions.
Yeah.
And I think the question is, what's the proper playbook for a university president nowadays, and is there a university president or university that you think is getting it right?
Yeah. In terms of what Shafiq did, I think it was just, and the thing they rightfully got dinged on was just being wildly inconsistent. I mean, for a while there, they were talking about, they're basically tolerating long-term encampments on campus, which they don't actually have to allow. And then when Shafiq was invited to testify on Capitol Hill, like the next day, she calls in the police. It's kind of like, okay, that seems pretty unprincipled right there. Like, it basically seemed like you immediately bowed to political pressure to shut down the encampments, and you didn't really have to allow the encampments to begin with. Then she said, we'll never call the police again. And then as soon as they said that almost as soon as they said they would never call the police again, students and a lot of non-students, by the way, took over Hamilton. I think it's Hamilton Hall. And as far as like a bad fact with my lawyer hat on, when your client says, I will not be removed from this place I'm illegally, other than through violence for being arrested. And it's kind of like, okay, that you made this issue pretty clear. You're basically saying that this is your only choice is to call the police at that point. But so I think Columbia just mishandled it terribly, and they lost the trust of students on it in a way that other schools that handled it really clearly and directly, like UVA did, actually really benefited from. Now, what's the playbook? I think universities need to rethink what they've been doing for a very long time, and it starts from admissions on down. I think that, I'm a First Amendment lawyer. I defend activists. That's part of the job. I defend protesters, absolutely, and unapologetically. But I think when you're recruiting students, what you really need to be looking for, and I said this, by the way, way back in my first book, Unlearning Liberty 2012, you need to be recruiting people with a scholarly mindset. And the difference between the activist mindset and the scholarly mindset is activism is ultimately about, I am so certain of this one cause that I will not question it. And in the most extreme examples, and this wasn't always the case, by the way, but definitely is the case on campus, I'm even going to shut down people who disagree with it. This happened to agree, by the way, in the often over sanctified 60s, where people were, they could shut down speeches, for people who were supportive of the Vietnam War, for example, because they were so sure that there was no argument to the contrary. So activism, and I think that it's gotten a lot worse, that we now kind of sort of chunk together, a dozen unrelated beliefs and treat them as if to disagree with them as a form of secular blasphemy. This happens on the right as well, but on campuses, you're mostly talking about some of the idiosyncrasies of the left. And the scholarly mindset is one that's kind of like, wow, I might be wrong. Like the universe of the unknown is an almost infinite ocean, and I can only hope to get a little tiny drop of it in my entire lifetime. So I better be, intellectually, or as I more pretentiously refer to it, epistemically humble, that I should try to figure out where people are coming from, because I'm a limited human being, and I should be constantly curious about what other people's opinions are, what their views are. And even if I think their opinions are dead wrong, stupid, or even bigoted, I still want to know why and how you came to that belief. Are you the victim of your upbringing, or is it are there particular conspiracy theories I've never heard before that are actually really popular? I want to know why. And I think that universities need to sort of recommit to recruiting people with the scholarly mindset, because they've really been favoring activists. Now, meanwhile, I think I probably benefited from my own activist background when I got into Stanford. Um, and I think they liked the fact that I did environmental justice work before undergrad. And am I saying that I think they probably should have been more interested in whether or not I had changed my mind on things or could have dialogue across lines of difference, which I also could very much argue I can do, and come from a different background than a lot of my classmates that involved a lot more of productive disagreement. I think that they have to start from the admissions on up. So that was a long-winded way of saying you have to change the pipeline, and that's one of the things saying that that this is going to be a long process. Then you have to have a free speech orientation that explains all of these really kind of like not intuitive ideas about the fact that truth is hard to know. Our brain doesn't want us to believe in true things. Our brain wants us to believe in useful things. Things are to our advantage, and that we need other people's brains to sort of working in a very disciplined way to help us understand the world as it is, because without certain rules, codified in things like the scientific method, we're just not going to get there. We're going to live by our own prejudices and preferences. So that needs to be explained on day one. There needs to be activities that actually reinforce that. I always thought, like, if I had like one wish to change education as we know it, I would require every American student to, in their junior year of high school, to do a formal debate, and they had to take the opposite point of view from what they actually believed, because once you've done that even once, it becomes a lot harder to assume that everyone who disagreed with you on other things is either stupid or evil. So they need that in orientation. They need to retrain their administrators, because administrators are a big part of the problem here. One thing that is a dirty little secret of higher ed is that a lot of the shout downs that you see, a lot of the cancel campaigns against professors, administrators are encouraging that. They're not just not protecting, not preventing them. In many cases, these are administrators, who are part of the problem, and they need to be either retrained or let go. So I think that the challenge is to reform a university, to get it to a place where it can be a reliable producer of hardy knowledge. I think it's a long road back.
Yeah, what was interesting, when I was in college, I was on the debate team, policy debate team, and every tournament we'd have to take the affirmative 3 times and the negative 3 times. So on the same issue. So it's kind of what
That's
you're
healthy.
talking about, for sure. Now, you, as part of your surveys, you ask students, and you had a student experiences survey last year that I was looking at, where you said 1 in 10 college students report that they were disciplined or threatened with discipline for their expression.
It's now up to 1 in 3 in the latest one.
And then you also have 38% of students say speech they heard on campus constitutes an act of violence. And I was thinking about these 2 data points, and I'm like, and I know this is not the only data you track,
Yeah.
but I was thinking about how those 2 things come together to make me not trust the student's own reporting. So that 1 out of 10 the first time, which is now 3 out of 10.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps those are the same students who also think speech is violence. So maybe I don't trust them to say they were disciplined for their speech. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, no, yeah. We discussed that, and about the student perception that in some cases they are probably being punished for stuff that they could actually be punished by, but that brings me back to the point about university, but that's still on the university, because they haven't taught them the difference. And that's one of the things that made the point about the schools that ended up in the top 10. I mean, Claremont McKenna is kind of like a story of I think it's the highest
an outlier, because most of them are state schools on that top 10, except for them.
Highest rated private college, and they really work at it, and they treat their students like adults and like scholarly adults, and explain to them some of this stuff. So universities can't turn around and say, oh, we're being dinged on the survey because students think that it's freedom of speech to have a permanent encampment or to threaten somebody with bodily harm or death or all this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, no, but that's your fault. Like you didn't teach them this. It's kind of like me complaining about my kids not knowing stuff. It's like, I can't believe they don't know that. Like my dad would sometimes complain about us not knowing Russian, which was absolutely outrageous because he never bothered to speak to us in Russian. My dad's Russian. And it's like, yeah, no, that was really on you, Dad. So like it's the same thing in academia. It's kind of like, yeah, your students are dinging you because they think that they have a right to permanent encampments. Well, guess what? You should have told them they don't.
And so there are kind of two sides of this, right? There's the rights of the students to express themselves and to hear different viewpoints, and then there's the rights of the professors.
Yes.
The professor side of things, I think for the lay person, intuitively they get, hey, it's important to have tenure, freedom of expression protections. But then sometimes when I hear the examples, I'm like,
Yeah.
I already believe that these universities have too many soft like departments that are not really producing a lot of good for society. And then I hear about this
That's a nice
professor-
way to put it.
Yeah. Well, I hear about this
Soft.
professor who wants to like, their research is like, leads to crazy ideas that like, yes, protected First Amendment, but I'm like,
and non-falsifiable ideas in a lot of cases too.
and then I'm like, and then they're being protected by tenure.
Yeah.
And I have mixed feelings about it. I'm like, yes, I don't want to create rules to just punish people for their viewpoints, but at the same time, firing people because they aren't producing things that are worth for society, I kind of want that. So it's like, I'm like, I don't know if that makes any sense. Or I'm like, I don't know if these people should be fully protected. If that makes sense.
It's a good tension, and in a healthier university, it is an understandable tension, and it's something that I think about a lot. I do think that we've created entire departments that have sort of non-falsifiable beliefs about the world that are heavily ideological, and they more or less exist as systems to just prove over and over again why they're right. And I think that is a real problem, because like in a healthier academy, like what the way you would actually rein in a professor who is just blatantly ideological, cannot ever accept that they might be wrong or have to rethink another thing, who might believe that Stalin was actually a saint, and no amount of evidence will actually convince them. And there is a real professor like that, by the way, who I'm thinking of. His name is Grover Furr. But the remedy to that was supposed to be the other academics saying, that's actually terrible teaching, and you're showing yourself to be a terrible scholar, because that's considered legitimate for departments to decide. And obviously, kind of like if someone shows up doing math wrong for calculus, it's kind of like, I'm sorry, you can't be a professor here. You have to have some way to evaluate the quality of the scholarship and the quality of the teaching. But unfortunately, particularly in these soft studies departments, they don't they haven't been doing that. Like they kind of want, like, are you reflecting back to us our pre-existing beliefs? And that's profoundly unhealthy. And how exactly you fix that is tough. I mean, I sometimes think that some of these universities are so far gone, they should probably, recommit to being technology schools, because like that's the thing that you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You want to make sure that if someone wants to get a hard science degree, that we make that as easy as possible. But for other schools, I think Dartmouth gives me a little bit of hope for what it's doing, but I think we should try to do some of what Dartmouth is doing right on a broader scale. And I think that we have turned academia into sort of an unscholarly certainty factory, where essentially it's more about reaffirming what you already thought and making you all the more certain and all the more have your biases all the more confirmed that you're always right in the first place. And having a really overbearing professor who, you learn that the right answer is whatever the professor says, is also unscholarly. It's also unhealthy. But how do you actually address that? You address that by having a class that is co-taught by two people who disagree with each other, because it makes you aware of the fact that there's not just one way to look at it that the professor says is right. So I think there should be a lot more co-taught classes with people who actually disagree with each other. But here's the thing: for a lot of these,
there are no conservatives in universities.
Yeah. Well, and here I'm not even necessarily talking about conservatives. I'm talking about, center left people in a lot of cases. That if you can't find anybody who disagrees on, particularly on matters of politics, you probably have to import them. And I think there would be great hostility to this idea. But I do think that in some of these departments, the sort of function of making sure that you have high quality scholarship and you have high quality teaching has fallen to the wayside, and I don't blame people for being annoyed about it.
And remind us what the data is on, and I'm a Democrat, and
Same.
it's like, but this is alarming to me as somebody who
Oh yeah.
likes like diversity of thought. What,
Well,
what is the latest data?
I always
on
make
what
the
we have?
distinction. I'm a liberal. Growing up, particularly in the '90s, there was always kind of like the wacky left. That was kind of like, the kind of people who thought Stalin was kind of okay. And I feel like it's unfortunate that I feel like some of the people we largely thought were kind of ridiculous by the time the '90s came around are kind of winning to a degree. But anyway, sorry, what was the question?
Oh, just the data on campus of like professors and political
Oh
affiliation.
yeah, no, it tends to be worse depending on how more at more elite colleges. But there are entire departments that don't have a single conservative. And here's what should really freak you out is that the younger cohort of students, of future professors, are even less politically diverse. So we can't just wish this problem away. It's going to get worse over time unless we actually try to figure out some way to increase the viewpoint diversity among the professorate. And it was funny watching people, when this was first kind of proposed 20 years ago, the sneering, at this idea being, oh, it's affirmative action for conservatives. And it's like, but keep in mind that affirmative action, the justification for it was to increase viewpoint diversity on campus by proxy.
Yeah, and the person we're serving is not the professor. They're a means to an end to growing the students. Now, one thing that's fascinating to me is a lot of the things you wrote about in the coddling of the American mind, right? The untruth of emotional reasoning, for example, the leveraging of anecdotes to create moral panics and all that.
Yeah.
I would add to it, and I'm not sure if you guys articulated this, but like a postmodern relativism of thought that I've noticed. These things are now rampant on the mainstream right now too. Maybe they were always there, but you look at Springfield, Ohio. The way that they're talking about crime statistics now, for example, is almost a page out of your book about how you talked about the moral panic of crime when crime was going down. If I remember your book correctly, you were talking about how despite crime going down, the mechanisms of media and culture were elevating very alarming anecdotes and creating panic. And then there's the relativism of where there really isn't a truth and it's all about how you feel. Correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, but this feels like what is coming out of the mainstream of the Republican Party now too.
Yeah, no, this is deeply demoralizing, and you sound like someone who's like me, who's kind of like, oh, great, neither, like, basically, I feel like the major lessons of the 20th century were essentially ideology is dangerous. It's a way to not think seriously about things or not to think for yourself. And that we don't really understand that essentially we need a better, more sophisticated understanding of economics are two of the main lessons of the 20th century. And we're in 2024 and we've just like, oh, never mind that. Like, and right and left, have kind of thrown this out the window. The idea that, and I think maybe it's Jonathan Rauch who said this, or maybe someone beat him to it, but he referred to Trump as the first postmodernist president.
Oh, I'd never heard that before. That's great.
Which I like.
But here's the thing, and this is why my politics are what they are, is I just from where I'm sitting, and there's, there've been articles about this, like The Economist had a really good article this week about the unwoking of America or something.
Yeah.
It's like, I from where I'm sitting, the left is they're having a sort of a vigorous debate where or at least I would say, are minimizing some of these forces, not to like a full extent, but even if you look at the change in Kamala Harris, like the movement from identity politics to a more centrism, right?
More pragmatic, yeah.
Whereas when I look on the right, it feels like they are where we were in 2018, right? They're actually it feels like they're reaching a crescendo. Let's hope it's a crescendo, but like it seems like they're reaching their maximal point while we're kind of a few years out from what I hope was our maximal point. Maybe this is me being optimistic, but that's kind of what it feels like to me.
Yeah, I'm not super optimistic. So basically kind of like a lot of what I've learned over the past 24 years is that the left wants to do anything other than kind of like see the problems in itself. And a lot of times when I talk about this, I immediately get but the right's crazy too. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I take that for granted. It's like always, but you got to fix things in your own house. And I think, honestly, the left is much further away from actually fixing it than they currently sound like they are, partially because it's an election year and you got to get a lot more reasonable during an election year. But the right, getting away from the sort of like libertarian, I'm civil libertarian, so obviously I like at least half, agree with libertarianism when it comes to things like freedom of speech, etc. I also would like universal health care and so like I'm very kind of like typical, 1980s, 1990s Democrat. But what is actually happening on the right? It's hard to disentangle though from Trump himself. Like the idea of like, will this fever break to a degree if this man is no longer the candidate? But it also feels impossible to know. Like, will it forever be this weird hodgepodge of sort of postmodernist thinking? And I honestly,
well, that's why we're speaking on Tuesday, the day of the vice presidential debate. JD is a good example of somebody who I'd followed closely because he was only a couple of years after me in law school. And I admired his early version of JD Vance as somebody who came from different political ideology than me, but who I thought was articulating a set of beliefs and grievances and trying to like speak truth to the people from his community and all that. But you look at him, he is as postmodern, and sort of you could go through the checklist of coddling of American mind. He was I don't think I've ever seen any prominent politician on the national stage communicate the emotional truth the way he did around Springfield, where he was being asked point blank, being confronted with the fact that he was telling lies and was saying, well, this is just how my people feel.
And this is exactly what happened on campus, by the way. Like essentially there was a number of there was something like that happened at Williams where there was was it Williams? This happened at a couple colleges where someone was claiming that a black person had been murdered on campus, and then it came out that this actually was a false story, but had been planted by someone who wanted to reveal a larger truth. And the university said, well, at least this reveals a larger truth. I was kind of like, no, but it's still lying. And I can see this, of course, in politics, people pull this nonsense all the time, but it's gotten way more intense on the right. And like I honestly, Ravi, I think we're headed towards a crisis. Not to be overly pessimistic about it, but I do, and I don't see how this version of the right is sustainable.
Well, I do think that there is a majority of centrists in this country.
There is,
and that's why I think like this election is interesting.
That's why we need ranked choice voting.
Yes, and we have it in New York. Unfortunately, it got us Adams last time, who was kind of the centrist candidate, but he had other problems, obviously, as we speak. He's in big trouble. But as you look ahead, right, and you wrote this incredible book with our good friend Ricky Schlatt about the canceling of the American mind, which I highly recommend, which has tons of examples of, because I often get the question, tell me the person who's canceled. I'm sure you've heard this before, and I've seen people struggle with this question publicly, in part because the public examples of the canceled are not the greatest salespeople. Aaron Rodgers, all these people. There's a really funny video with Lisa Kudrow where she's like, I've been canceled, and then it's like a skit where I've been canceled, and then I go on Rogan. She's going on new platforms talking about being canceled, but they're all the biggest platforms, right? Which is kind of speaking to a certain disingenuous deployment of this argument of people who say they're canceled, right? It's like Aaron Rodgers is not canceled, right? He's very successful, right?
He's a baseball player, right?
No, football. Yeah. But
I was a football player, but I just don't follow it.
So there are all these people who are bad poster people for being canceled.
Yeah.
But as you point out, there are a lot of people who are not powerful in your book who actually have had their lives ruined, not because they even said anything bad, which, by the way, you should be able to survive saying something bad in a lot of cases. But in a lot of the cases, they were just saying the truth.
Yeah.
or being punished for them. You maybe want to just elevate one example of this, because I think for some of our listeners, making it tangible is helpful.
Well, here's why your listeners need to be really concerned about this, because people can see the individual cases in isolation and then be like, oh, what's the big deal? But the big deal is that, particularly as when it happens in academia, it creates a situation in which the public looks up to these experts and said, wait a second, did someone just have their career ruined for saying something that everyone believed was true 15 minutes ago, or for saying saying something that's unpopular in academia? Like, are they suddenly under investigation because it wasn't popular in academia? And here's the most devastating thing about this: it leads to a situation where people don't trust the people who are supposed to be our experts, because they don't think they're going to be objective, and they're right on this. Like, and I always give, like, I oftentimes give the example of Carol Hooven at Harvard, but in some ways I think Roland Fryer, at Harvard again.
Yeah, I was a former charter school leader, so Roland is somebody who I don't know personally, but his research very much informed the work I did.
Yeah. Well, Roland Fryer is a very serious economist, and it also, something that he actually bridges, I think, the biggest divide between elite education and everyone else. So something I experienced at Stanford is actually the class divide. Like, he's black, but he grew up poor, and he became like a very serious economist, and he started writing. He started doing research on whether or not there were actually higher rates of unarmed black men being shot by police. And he thought, going into it, this is going to be the easiest research I've ever done, because it's just so obvious that this is true. Now, what did he actually find? What he found was that black people are manhandled by police more often. And he also concluded that too many people are shot by cops in the United States. I also think partially an artifact of having an overwhelmingly armed population. But the evidence that it was disproportionately unarmed black men just didn't come out in the data. And so he was encouraged by Harvard people to not publish this, to not talk about this out loud, to not do any, to basically hide his research. And he's had too much integrity to do something like that. He's like, I'm sorry, this is what we actually found. It doesn't mean that we don't need massive police reform. It is actually an argument for police reform, just it doesn't exactly comport to what I assumed we would find. And then next thing you know, and this is super typical, by the way, having done this now for 24 years, suddenly he's under investigation for harassment because of, I think, some off-color jokes he told at a private Thanksgiving party. And this is not coincidental. Like, this is boringly predictable in my experience. They investigated him for like 3 years and then found, okay, actually, no, this was BS. One of the people who allowed for this, and I think encouraged this happening, was actually Claudine Gay. And I think that when people look at this, they're kind of like, okay, that's pretty freaking obvious. Like, he said something you didn't like, and then you tried to figure out some excuse to go after him. But I think that this is tragic and frustrating to do to someone like Roland, but it's a warning to all other professors: toe the line, or else, or don't even do this research in the first place. And that harms our belief in our collective facts. And I think that it's devastating to a democracy where we need experts who we think that, listen, this may be unpopular in the circles I'm in, but this is what our research shows, and that's what we're following. And I think that people, rightfully at this point, are somewhat skeptical that the expert class is really being honest with them.
Yeah, I thought about this with COVID, where I was always like a fairly, like, I'm just like a generally like an institutionalist, which is what makes this all depressing for me, because I both
Yeah.
understand why people don't trust institutions, but I can't imagine not having them. A good example is the FBI, when there's like all this alt media stuff around the deep state, and Trump has obviously fanned these flames, where
Yeah.
I would routinely go on the show and just read the press release page from the FBI. Sex trafficking ring, child abduction, yada. And I'd be like, you don't want to abolish the FBI, people.
No.
You don't trust me. But at the same time, I also understand why people lose faith in some of these institutions. A good example is New York, where, for example, this is not even a cancellation thing. It's just the former COVID czar in New York. I don't know if you've been following this story, but
Is this the sex party one?
yeah, he's just like, he was like caught on video saying, like, bragging about all sorts of stuff that really, like, it just showed an arrogance, and it also showed a level of, like, entitlement where like everybody was, people, a lot of my friends in Staten Island, for example, were city workers who, some of them lost their jobs, and a lot of them, bars were shut down at this period of time, and they lost their livelihoods. And look, and those are tense conversations, because in some cases during that, I was pro the restrictionist policy.
Sure.
Right. And I've softened a bit on some of these things since, but it makes it hard for me as somebody who's defending these institutions when there's this level of arrogance, right? And this guy, his arrogance was outside of the kind of arrogance we're talking about today. But I do think of it in science. Like, I forget this gentleman's name, McClarty, I think is his name. He's a doctor who wrote a book about, he's a John Hopkins doctor who we're going to have on in a couple of weeks, who wrote this book all about medical dogma. And how do you know the book I'm talking about?
No, I got to read that. That's right up my alley.
Yeah, I'll pull it up by the end of this to make sure you have it. Let me see. I'll find it here as we're talking. But he, I found him interesting because I was listening. Oh, it's called Blind Spots. His name's Marty McCary. Mm-hmm. And look, as I read the book, there's not everything that's in the book that I agree with.
Sure.
But what I find interesting is here's a very accomplished physician who describes, some of it's wrapped up in academia, but in this case, he extends it to the broader medical consensus, where he says, look, there's this kind of pressure within medicine, right? Like to conform and all of this. And it made me depressed because I have a lot of people in my life who have what I think are absolutely outrageous beliefs about medicine and science.
Yeah.
But the route to get there is understandable to me, because they see these institutions of authority and they see them cutting corners. They see them getting defensive. They see them
being arrogant,
being dogmatic, right? And I'm saying, like, look, when this is done well, science is about challenging authority and presenting evidence and revisiting assumptions. And to be clear, that happens a lot. And as you probably know from your research, the hard sciences are way better on a lot of this stuff than the softer ones. They're not perfect, but they are way better.
As long as it doesn't have political valence, generally, I think a lot of these mechanisms work pretty well.
Yeah, and we can go into some of that, which is that is some of the most dangerous territory out there. But I guess, like, as a closing point here, I know that you're pessimistic. I could hear it in your voice, but what there, maybe we'll talk a good place to end is, like, there are new institutions cropping up now, new universities. Some of these are associated with the right, so I think some people on the left and the center sometimes view them with a little bit of suspicion. But tell us a little bit about where you see some green shoots here, some possibility.
I definitely, I'm for the experimentation at places like University of Austin. And I remember going on the argument for the New York Times, Jane Coaston, who I love. But the argument was essentially, oh, this is just going to turn into a right-wing university. And I'm like, I can't argue that it's not going to. That would be predicting the future. But I think that every experiment to try to do something different that is more committed to truth should be applauded by every American. Also, to do it in a less expensive way. I think we should be. I think we should be getting out of the way to allow these kind of experiments. I also, and this is going to sound a little weird, I think AI used intelligently could actually help a great deal with this, because right now we are sitting on mountains of research that isn't very good. And I think that one thing that you can really have AI help you out with is figure out, is this research p-hacked? Is it high quality research? Are the sample sizes meaningful? To actually try to discount a lot of a lot of the BS that we currently take as true, if we empower it to do it that way. I think that there's one group that I've been consulting with, but apparently there are others trying to figure out ways to have social media platforms that actually prioritize the discovery of truth. And to create rules that actually make it, safe to come up with unpopular conclusions. So I think that if we're allowed to, unless these things are killed in the cradle, that there are some possibilities to actually sidestep to a degree a lot of these problems, and to get, because here's the thing about the nature of truth. Truth is, you may know it, but it's impossible to know that you know it. But that doesn't mean that you can't get close to it, because one thing that I think even the biggest relativists can't disagree with is we certainly know that some things are false. And what the discovery of truth is really more the chipping away at the untrue, and getting and zeroing into the possibility of like what might actually be in that center. And if we could actually deploy and use AI, deploy new institutions with high integrity, deploy new experiments, we could actually get back to the arduous process of understanding the world as it is, that we so desperately need to create a universe where your relatives who are, and friends who are skeptical of institutions can be confident in them again because they realize, now they're actually being honest with us.
Yeah, and a book that's like unintentionally inspiring on this front is Mukherjee's book on genes. I
Uh,
think it's called Gene, and I just reread it recently, and it's an expansive history of everything from Gregor Mendel to Darwin
Lysenko, I'm sure.
and like the revolution and genetics all the way up to today, and in terms of and you see one big leap after another, but also accompanied by a debate in politics, social science. Like a good example is eugenics, right?
Yeah.
And what you learn through this process is that we have done this before.
Yeah.
Now the challenges are
Over
unique.
and over
Yeah,
again, by the
the
way.
challenges are unique. The internet is more powerful and all of that. But I think a good example is the sort of early 20th century experience of eugenics through the Holocaust. That was its own version of very challenging,
Sure.
where the science and the humanities overlapped. And you look at, yes, there are extremely horrible examples of overbearing institutions and bad culture in higher education, and it is uniquely bad today. It is bad in a unique way, but you can go back and think about, well, what was it like, being Einstein, for example, having to flee Germany and, dealing with so much anti-Semitism within academic institutions in Germany and Austria, right? Like, people have weathered storms before, and you can, this is a new battle, against new foes, but in some ways there are echoes of it in the past.
Absolutely, and that's the thing is I think about the sort of like the neuroscience of certainty. Like we are prone to want simple explanations, to have truths that we can always refer back to decrease kind of like the uncertainty of life. And you have to get back, and be periodically reminded to shake things up and to get in the habit again of applying thought experimentations, devil's advocacy, counterfactuals to every sacred cow that we hold dear. And I do think that when I talk about it, I think we're heading into a crisis. There is good news to that. Is I think that oftentimes on the other side of a crisis, some of the real reform can actually begin. So I do think that some of the path we're on is unsustainable. I am seeing some universities, like the recent talk by the president of Stanford, are starting to show some glimmers of hope. And I am optimistic for one reason on the future of freedom of speech, that because freedom of speech works really well. Like a society that doesn't have it just isn't going to function all that well. It's not going to know where its problems are. So I do think that I'm not so pessimistic that I don't think there's hope. I just think that we might go through something even more profoundly bad before we actually get there.
Yeah, maybe we'll leave on the question of Stanford, which if people are looking for a reason, depending on what your beliefs are in some of these practices, maybe you don't think this is hopeful, but what we have now in Stanford is a university with very different structural elements than a few years ago. There is no affirmative action, at least legally. There isn't allowed. There's no legacy now. That was just passed this week in California. And then you have a university president who is espousing beliefs very much in line of what we were hoping for in this conversation. Now, you might not like all three of those things,
Sure.
but those are three very different elements of incentives, structural elements involved in the school. And it would be interesting to see where the next few years take us in
and we should all be pulling
like
for it. The fact that they made Jenny Martinez, who actually handled the shout down of a Fifth Circuit judge last March, not the March before last, is a great sign, because Jenny did a great job. I know her, so I can call her Jenny. Did a great job on that. She actually got back to first principles. So, if we could
She's the law school dean, is that right?
She was the law school dean, but they made her provost.
Oh, wow. Okay, great.
You
Yeah.
know, so I do, you know, I also realize that I can't be entirely unbiased because it's my alma mater and I
Yeah.
had some of the best years of my life there. But I will hold them to account if they disappoint me again.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it. I went to Yale law school and Binghamton undergrad,
pizza.
very different institutions. But I think of Columbia probably the way you think of Stanford, which is as a New Yorker, I'm very protective of it, but
Yeah.
also profoundly disappointed
Yeah.
in where it has been,
Yes.
and I want to rescue it. I just
Same. Yeah.
you know, and I'm not a member of that community. I just have always held it in such high regard, you know,
Yeah.
and I'm pulling for it.
Yeah, I'm a little less pulling for Columbia, but that's partially because I had an uncle who went there who always seemed like kind of, well, anyway. But you know, I'm pulling for Yale because again, great pizza.
Yeah. Well, Greg, thank you so much. Plug away here. Where can we find all your work?
Check out thefire.org. We defend freedom of speech all across the board. We have a motto that we'd rather drive this bus into a wall rather than be unprincipled. And so check it out, and check out my and Ricky's book, The Canceling of the American Mind, and my book with my friend John Haidt, The Coddling of the American Mind as well. Oh, I have a Substack called The Eternally Radical Idea as well.
Great. Well, thank you, Greg. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Ravi. Take care.
All right.